And the House health care bill does face an uncertain future in the Senate. Republicans can afford to lose only 2 votes, and there's an enormous gap between what conservative hardliners want and what more moderate Republicans will accept. So joining me now is Republican Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us on Meet the Press. Well, let's start with something that Secretary Price said. He's going to improve Medicaid by cutting, at least in the first version of this bill, and we don't have a score yet from the budget office, the Congressional Budget Office, as to how much would be cut from this bill. But from the first version, you're cutting $880 billion, but making it better? I mean, the president doesn't propose something he likes, like the military, will be made better by cutting almost $1 trillion from the military. He wants to spend more.
Well, I think part of the point is here we're on the path to spend $1 trillion, and really the only addition this significant to health care coverage under Obamacare are people who got expanded Medicaid as part of that. You know, this system is just not working. The individual market is collapsing and has been.
So why not fix those market issues?
Well,
why not do the fixes rather than taking Medicaid expansion, slashing it, and addressing pre-existing conditions by basically saying it's not a requirement. Insurers can just up the price and price it out of the market for people.
Well, I think the goal here should be to include people in the system who aren't in it yet, to give people more choices, to create more competition. I don't talk to anybody who doesn't believe there has to be a way that's better than the current system to be sure that people that have pre-existing conditions continue to be covered. And for the states to have more options in Medicaid is a good thing, not a bad thing. Every state is different. This is a huge budget issue in every state. People need things like a medical home if that's what the state thinks they can put together. So you have a place to go. You know, coverage is different than access. And both in the insurance market, where a lot of people have coverage, but nobody has a place to go because their deductible's so high, or in Medicaid, where people are covered, but doctors increasingly don't want to take Medicaid patients, those are the kind of problems we ought to be solving.
Well, some of your Republican senators have already spoken out against it. Rob Portman from Ohio that the House bill does not do enough to protect Ohio's Medicaid expansion population. Lindsey Graham says it needs to be viewed with suspicion. Is this dead on arrival? Are you starting over? Are you taking the House bill and trying to improve on it? What are your bottom lines?
You know, I think what's happening is not dead on arrival, not taking the House bill and bringing it immediately to the floor, but taking what the House was able to do, looking at that carefully, and coming up with what the Senate thinks the Senate can do. You know, this is the way legislation used to be passed. There'd be a House bill, there'd be a Senate bill, then you'd get together the conferees who understood by that time the intricacies of what they're doing and come up with a bill that can go to the president's desk, and I hope that's what we do here.
Presumably you will read what you're working on and actually get a Congressional Budget Office score. The House didn't wait.
Well, we will. And from the House's perspective, you know, they added a few things late, but this is not a new issue. The Senate's going to have the kind of score they need to move this forward. And the Senate's going to be looking at this to see what we can do to take the House work, look at what the House did, look at what we can do to improve that in our view, and then see if that's a bill that in all likelihood you have to go back to the House and say, here's what you think, here's what we think. Let's be sure we give people more access. Let's be sure we solve the problems of Obamacare. You know, a third of the counties in America only have one insurance company willing to offer insurance on the individual market. 5 states only have one company willing to offer insurance. There's something dramatically wrong with the current system. I saw one of my Democrat colleagues this week said that this system isn't working, and he said, I'm maybe willing to be part of a repeal and replace strategy, and we need to hear and see more of that.
Will you be able to do something that satisfies Susan Collins on the Planned Parenthood issue, and also can satisfy the Freedom Caucus if you produce something that goes back to a conference committee with the House?
Well, you know, obviously, if we're successful, we have to do something that either gets 50 senators and the vice president or 60 senators for even more broad-based change, and we ought to be looking at both of those options.
Let me ask you about the Senate Intelligence Committee. You serve on the committee. The Senate Intelligence Committee has now written letters asking for a number of former associates or Republican operatives who were involved in the campaign, like, well, Paul Manafort was the campaign manager, and Carter Page, Roger Stone, asking what their contacts with the Russians were. Are you going to get to the bottom of this possible Russian connection that the FBI started investigating all the way back in July?
Well, I think there's no question there was Russian interference in our elections, just like we're seeing now in France and seeing in Germany. In fact, in Europe, we've seen for well over a decade the Russians trying to interfere. So we need to look at that. That's one issue. We need to look at that in a way that better prepares us for 2018 and 2020. And in terms of bringing everybody in that should be talked to, I think, the Senate Intelligence Committee is the one committee that's been asked to reach conclusions here. And that conclusion needs to include talking to anybody that a reasonable person thinks we should have talked to, looking at anything that a reasonable person would think we should have looked at, and hopefully a largely bipartisan consensus of here's what we found. And I think what you saw this week was the indication that that process of now bringing individuals in after a tremendous background effort to see what we ought to be asking is happening.
And Sally Yates testifying tomorrow before a subcommittee of Judiciary. What do you want to hear from Sally Yates? Because there are indications now that the Trump transition itself was warned about Mike Flynn and his connections and the conversations he'd had with the Russian ambassador.
Well, I think in terms of the transition team, and particularly the new national security advisor talking to ambassadors from around the world, there's nothing wrong with that.
But the substance of what he said.
What was particularly wrong was General Flynn not being truthful about the substance of what he said. And the campaign was apparently, or the transition rather, was apparently concerned about that early on, and it appears they should have been.
And the fact that you say that the Russians were involved, the president has still not accepted that reality. Why not?
Well, I think the president, I don't know what the president's view of this would be because I haven't talked to him about it.
Everything he said publicly has been to deny it and to call it a witch hunt.
Well, I think what he's talking about is collusion. What we're going to determine whether there was any or not, and where those facts lead us. I'm not sure that there's any reason for the president to believe that there was collusion between his campaign. I think the president has to understand at this point that the Russians were doing things to both increase their influence. I mean, the Russians couldn't be happier than have us on a Sunday when the French elections are going on, talking about how once again the Russians have figured out how to punch above their weight. This is a country that struggles economically. It's a country that resents its current role in the world, the diminished role it has now. And getting involved in these elections is one way that it can reassert itself in ways that it's not otherwise able to. And I think it's unfortunate for every democracy involved, just like it has been for over a decade in Europe. And the world should have been more concerned about this when those little countries were also fighting back as the Russians tried to involve themselves in their elections.
Senator Roy Blunt, thank you so much for being with us on Meet the Press.
Good to be with you.